Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast, in which I'm chatting to Jim Murphy, who was a US fighter pilot on F-15s, and his business is Afterburner, which he's also got a capital element to that as well. He's the author of 7 books, just a fantastic guy, and I've really enjoyed this connection. So, Murph, welcome to the Inspiring Leadership podcast. So firstly, let's have a chat about inspiring leaders that you know. I mean, we can all talk about ourselves, but who are a couple of CEO type inspiring leaders that you found inspiring that you'd like to call out?
Well, CEO leaders, it's funny. I think all of us have different leaders in our different life chapters. And I certainly had great leaders when I was younger, starting with my father and then a football coach principal that taught me the art of being curious, which I think drove a lot of my career after that. But in today's world, a couple of the CEO leaders, I've been around so many great CEOs and fortunate enough through Afterburner and our speaking engagements to work with ones that we've all read about. But I would say there's 2 that stand out. One would be Indra Nooyi. She's the former CEO of PepsiCo. And I just watched her navigate a very challenging global team and enterprise. I mean, it truly is a global enterprise. Not only is the scale impressive in itself and the moving parts from logistics to sales and marketing and branding and all the other things that go into it, but then, just her diversity of thought, the way that she led, she was very pure in who she was, her own guiding principles. They just really resonated. And no matter where you were in the organization, you felt like you had a personal connection with the CEO.
And did you have the chance to work with her?
I did. As a matter of fact,
Wow.
spent quite a bit of time with her and her global leadership team. So I got a chance to interact with her and watch her in action, and more importantly, spent a lot of time with her direct reports. And unanimously, they loved her as a leader.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you mention it because a lot of people speak about her and what she does. I personally, on someone health and wellness and the battle I have against the ultra processed food companies, I have an issue with sugar water, which of course is the whole business is built on it. But
Right.
you can't take away from the fact it's an incredibly well led and well run business. But I think, yeah, what a great choice and what great experience to have. So who was the second one?
I would say another one, and again, there's just so many I could mention, but I would say that Brian Cornell at Target is another leader. And I've had a chance to watch Brian at many of his leadership roles before he became the CEO of Target. And obviously that's been his most challenging post so far. There's a major retailer that was navigating, how do we compete with Amazon and be more digital in the way that we are going about things? And then, how do we stay true to our brand and our constituents with some of the other big box competition and specific retailers? So watching Brian navigate that has been a pleasure as well. I think it's been, certainly a challenge. And anytime I think the leader of a retailer in today's world, it's a tough road. But almost like Indra in a lot of ways, all the different logistical challenges and the different types of employee groups that you have to impact and keep aligned on a daily basis is it's a credit to Brian and his leadership.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you on this podcast. I'm often interested in, you're a great storyteller. I know I've listened to many of your fascinating presentations and talks you've given online. There's always that sort of story of then, now, and how. And in a way, I'd love to hear your then, how you were then, how you are now, the work you're doing now. How did you get there? How have you become the leader you are today? Would you just perhaps in a bit of a thumbnail? I know it's such a career and you've done so many different things, but take us from then to now and how did you get there? Even upbringing and that kind of stuff.
The easy story to talk about is from farm boy to fighter pilot. So I was raised on a small farm in central Kentucky from entrepreneurial dad and a farming mom. So I grew up listening to stories around the dinner table, like how to close and drive a pipeline and conversion. But at the same time, we'd have conversations about, what we're going to do, how we're going to water the horses, and what we're going to do with the manure, and what our tobacco base is going to look like for next year. So had all of those kind of conversations all going on at the same time. But then I was fortunate enough to be a pretty good athlete. So I went to college on a baseball scholarship and thought I was going to become a professional athlete, a baseball player. And I went to the University of Kentucky and played baseball, pretty good baseball school in the SEC, which is a really good conference in the United States. So high level, and I didn't end up going to the next level, which is the professional rank. So for me, it was really tough because I had to go back to my small Kentucky town where everybody expected that ending for me and look everybody in the eye and say, I didn't have what it takes to go to the next level. And that was tough. It was a great lesson to learn as a young man. And so then I went out and got a job like all of us have to do. And I started working for Toshiba, selling copiers and facsimiles. So that was great training, learning the art of cold calling and demonstration and canvassing territories. So it was great training for me. And I was very successful at doing it, but I met a fighter pilot who made a huge impression on me. And here was somebody doing something not everybody could do, something that was physically challenging, very patriotic in nature. And that appealed to me at the time. And also this movie, maybe you've heard of it, Top Gun came out about that time as well. And so there was my future in living color on the big screen. And that motivated me enough to figure out how to get out of my current situation and get into the one that I so desperately wanted. And so my fighter pilot journey began there. And what I found really unusual, especially from my perspective, is when I finally got into the Air Force, I left the farm, and in 16 months, I was solo in the F15, arguably at the time, the most sophisticated jet on the planet. And 16 months later, I'm flying the F15. And I remember climbing up the ladder at Luke Air Force Base and getting ready to fly the F-15 for the first time. And as the crew chief finished strapping me in, I just had an epiphany. And I said, how does a normal guy like me get here in this much time? And I realized that I had gone through a series of frameworks that were simple, scalable, but had powerful results. And I realized that the Air Force didn't even understand how to articulate these frameworks either. They had just agilely been created over time of being the most dominant force in the air. And because they have to create such a human capital pipeline and have such a diverse group of folks all the time. And I also thought it was very unusual that even though I felt like I was in just the absolute presence of excellence every single day, I was in probably one of the most inefficient groups on the planet, which is the US government. So in this real inefficient world, there were these pockets of extreme excellence. And that was in the fighter pilot world that I was in. So that made a huge impression on me. And so I vowed to start studying those processes, that heuristic, if you will, with the end game of turning it loose on businesses and athletic organizations. And literally the day that I soloed the F-15, I came up with this idea to create a company called Afterburner. And I would teach these frameworks to accelerate the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. So for the last 25 plus years, I've been traveling around the world doing just that. And we've created our own business model called Flawless Execution, which are the tenets of the fighter pilot ethos applied to businesses. And written a bunch of books on the subject, got a chance to go to Harvard and talk about it, and MIT, and a bunch of different companies, and work with great CEOs and athletic teams, and help some teams go to the Super Bowl here in the United States with American football. So it's just been a great ride and a great experience. And about 10 years ago, I finally had the epiphany. I think I was working with Pat Gelsinger at VMware, now the Intel CEO, and we were doing some really cool stuff for VMware at the time. And I started looking at all the value that we had driven in these large enterprises, but Afterburner was a pretty small company. We were doing really big things, but we weren't very big. And I realized that the real magic of what we were doing could be applied to our own portfolio of companies. So we decided to start Afterburner Capital at the time and create a private equity firm where we could invest in our own small to mid-sized cap businesses, utilize this framework, and maybe even some of our veteran human capital to accelerate those businesses to give a great return for our investors. So that's what I'm doing now.
Wow. Well, people who are listening to this on Apple, Spotify, Google, and the likes won't see that you've gone from farm boy to fighter pilot, but now to Florida. And behind you, just to tell those who are listening, is the most beautiful home, which stretches out onto the water there, and all the speedboats. And you clearly have a quality life. You've worked hard for it, and you're now reaping the rewards. So congratulations on that. It's
Thank you.
interesting. You talked about going to do the training and things like that. I had Admiral Mike Manners here. I don't really know Mike, but lovely man. And he, as well as commanding the Nimitz and having moments where highs and lows in his life, he was a Top Gun pilot and really enjoyed that. And so he and his gang, I think they were at the place when Tom Cruise was doing the first filming. And they were
Oh yeah.
a
Okay.
few of his mates, and he appeared in the bar and things like that in some of the scenes in the early one. So they made use of some of the actual pilots. But look, I mean, for me, it's very special to meet a pilot with my father being a fighter pilot as well. I was killed when I was just 2.5 years old, but he did a lot of his training in America. In his case, with the U.S. Navy, Pensacola and Corpus Christi and around that sort of Bay Area, and made some great friends from the American pilots that have stayed with him throughout his life. So it's really quite special. Now, all that experience you have, and it's very clever to congratulations to you to actually realize that you want to set up your own PE company, because when I work with CEOs of businesses and their top teams, they often get these PE companies that come in and they go, we like your team, or we don't like your team, we'll put some other people in. But they don't seem to invest very much in the quality of the leadership team. They just buy someone new in, put them in, get 10x from it and go. So I think it's a gap in the market that you've clearly filling, but it's obviously a huge market of where you really are training the leaders of the organizations you're investing in, so they're going to lead it well and manage it well. Do you want to say a bit more? Because I think that's a really interesting area.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly what we're doing with large enterprises. Teaching indigenous teams within the enterprise or the enterprise itself how to align and be future-based in their thinking and their execution. And, it's one thing to be able to try to push people into the future you want them to have, but it's much better to pull and compel them and share the future that you want to have. So, everything that we do is future-based, is what we like to call it. And so there's frameworks and there's things that you can do with your leadership team, obviously, to get them to recreate and design the future they want to have. You certainly can't predict it, but you can design it. And that's where we like to start. That alignment process is just critical. Not only is it critical for the buy-in as a private equity firm comes in to acquire a business, but that second and third echelon of rank of leadership is going to be very skeptical, and involving them and getting their intellectual capital involved in developing this new future together is hugely empowering. I think you're right. I've seen a lot of private equity firms make the mistake of, we're going to replace the management team and we're going to push things from outside in. And although sometimes you might have to do that with the founder, rarely does that work across the board. So and if so, you're probably going to have a hard pivot, and it's going to take a while to get the momentum built back up again.
No, I think you're onto something very powerful there. So let's in all your experiences that you've had, clearly massively successful. As it appears, everybody goes, this is so easy, and he's lucky. He's just had an easy run, no problems for him. He's just blessed, from farm boy to fighter pilot to private equity fame. But we've all had some tough times, and probably we learn the most from them. I know I've made many mistakes, and that famous line someone once said, I learned so much from my mistakes, I think I'm going to go and make a few more. But you got quite badly bitten, quite stung with your own IP, and as you're building it up, other people wanted to come and take what you had, and they think, oh, I'll have a piece of that. And you trusted various people, and they stung you, and you got badly bitten by that. Do you want to say a bit about your experience and perhaps what you've learned from that?
Well, sure. I'm still learning every day and making those same mistakes. I mean, that's part of any agile framework. But, I will say, when you bring up private equity fame, I'm brand new in that game. So I'm making my own personal pivot into that. As you know, I was the operational CEO of Afterburner and a healthcare firm as well. So this is new ground as well for me. But you're referring to some things that I bumped into as the CEO of Afterburner. I mean, maybe some of the folks that are listening certainly understand this. I mean, when you start something from scratch and it's your own, and you put your own blood, sweat, and tears into it, but potentially your intellectual capital, it's tough. And one of the things that happened with me more than once is you create a team. You train the team goes out and finds lots of success based on the brand and the intellectual capital. But sometimes these team members believe, well, you know what? It's really me. It's not really the brand. It's not really the intellectual capital. It's really more about me. And, I've watched that happen more than once. And unfortunately, more than once, those folks, take liberty in what you've built and they try to go out and do their own thing. And sometimes they take more liberty than they should. And yeah, I watched this happen multiple times, actually right there in the UK, but I've seen it happen here in the US. And at some point, you finally have to say, okay, we've spent the time and the energy to protect our intellectual property, to protect our brand, invest in our brand and our people. And sometimes you have to draw the line. And, so I've had to use the legal system. When actually was in a very intense lawsuit with some former employees that took what we believed was our intellectual property and went out on the market and started competing with our clients in our database. So I know what that's like. It's tough to do. And sometimes you have to call on the justice system, as imperfect as it is here in the United States. But, sometimes you finally just have to draw that line. And I think intellectual law and intellectual capital, trademarking, service marketing, et cetera, with the AI and it's a wild, wild west out there right now. So I think, a lot of people are really trying to figure out what you can and can't protect. And, it's certainly important though, early on, I think to move and be pretty aggressive at protecting what's yours, because if not, you're going to lose it really quick,
Yeah.
especially with the global marketplace we're in today. I've seen our stuff end up in India, in Israel, all over the world. So,
well, I mean, in a strange way, that's sort of reflected glory that at least what you have is really good. And I think about my days in the British Army, where there were certain processes and things that we used in the army, which a number of people I've come across since then have sort of taken that model and adapted it to business and used it. But there's no doubt about it that for decision making, for strategy, you do need processes and systems, and you clearly have produced something that really, really works for people. So well done on that. Talking about a different kind of dark moment, you were in a business where it's life or death. You're traveling at such high speeds, a small error of judgment, or you just don't see something and suddenly you're dead. Clearly, in my father's case, they were constantly watching at the airfield. There'd be a plume of smoke, and someone would come and knock on the door, and the naval officer would be there saying, "Terribly sorry to tell you that your husband has been killed." You must have had those moments, and how did it affect you? Is my thoughts.
well, unfortunately, if you're in the flying business, especially in the fighter or the fast jet business, you're going to have those stories. And I still have them. A good friend of mine, that Richard McSpadden, who was an F-16 Thunderbird pilot and commander, was just killed this November.
Right.
Not in a military crash, but in a civilian crash. So, those are tough. I remember the very first time that I encountered that was actually in training at fighter lead-in training at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. So when you transition from flying jets and undergraduate pilot training, you go to an intermediate school where you learn to use the jets as a weapon. So you learn to dogfight, and you learn to drop bombs, et cetera. It's called fighter lead-in training. And I actually showed up a few days early for that training, and you're able to potentially sit in the back seat of an instructor that has a student ride, and you can kind of get ahead of your classmates a little bit. And I had signed up for one of these these back seat rides, and literally the flight before mine, a friend of mine was lucky enough to get one of the back seats, but there was a hard over rudder in the AT-38 that they were flying, and they had to eject. And my friend, who it was his first flight in the AT-38, was just getting a sandbag ride. He successfully ejected, but his pilot, the instructor pilot, was killed.
Mm.
And that was, pretty much day one showing up to fighter pilot training for me. So it made a huge impression.
Mm.
And then over the years, I've lost quite a few friends. I mean, it seems like lately, a lot of my older fighter pilot buddies have all gotten airplanes and gotten into flying. And tragically, I've lost quite a few in the last 5 years. Some pretty close squadron mates of mine.
Mm.
So it definitely happens. Yeah, unfortunately, that's kind of part of our profession.
Yeah. I mean, I've learned to follow the sort of Stoic philosophy. It's served me quite well. You can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it and your thoughts and actions. Do you find that's a philosophy you tend to follow? And memento mori, remember we are mortal, that we are going to have a good life, but let's have a good death as well. Do you have a kind of philosophy?
Absolutely. And I'm a believer in Christ. So when it's time to come home, it doesn't really matter what the circumstance is for everybody else, you're going to go home.
Yeah.
So, it's definitely tough. I tell you, in this case last November, when Spad was killed, he was the director of the Air Safety Institute for AOPA, which is the Airplane Owners and Pilots Association, the largest association of pilots, I think, on the planet. And he was the face, the epitome of professionalism and safety. So no matter where you are as a pilot, whether you're a brand new private pilot with a few hours, or somebody experienced, or maybe a former fighter pilot like myself, no matter what type of pilot you were, when that day happened, everybody just kind of took a pause, because something like this could happen to somebody like Spad. It could happen to anybody. So for me as a pilot that day, I won't forget it, because it was kind of maybe the first time that I ever just had a little lump in my throat and said, I'm not invincible.
Mm.
And nobody really is, because if anybody was, I thought Spad was, as a
Yeah.
pilot.
Yeah.
So it was certainly an interesting day.
Yeah, and it is, and you and I joked about, the classic one-liners, how do you know there's a fighter pilot at a cocktail party you're at? And the answer is they tell you they're a fighter pilot. And but there is this innate, apparent, huge self-confidence. And in some extremes, it can be overweening self-pride and arrogance. In other cases, it can be humility. So for someone like you who's been so successful with such a peer group, how do you get the balance right where you're not so cocky and so self-confident that it gets up people's noses, but at the same time you're not fake humility? It's a sort of balance in the middle, quiet confidence with gravitas and presence. How do you think people get that right? Because some don't get it right.
I agree with you. Some don't get it right. And, I have to credit my mom and dad for that one. Because you do have to have a sense of, humility and being humble, especially as a leader. And there are times where you really have to look in the mirror and realize, look, I'm definitely not the smartest person in the room. And I've always had this philosophy is I already know that going in. I'm a country boy from Kentucky, a baseball player that was fortunate enough to do some of these great things. But, when it comes time to assembling a team, I want to make sure that my team members are definitely smarter than me. So, I want to put together an A team if I can. So I'm always in search of folks that, are operating at or above my capabilities. And in my case, that's pretty easy.
Well, it's
But
interesting you said Kentucky, because I was trained by a real character who's very self-confident. His name is Marshall Goldsmith. I don't know if you come across Marshall, but
no,
he's from Kentucky, and he has written even more books than your seven, many books on coaching. He's had his own coaching business. He's now probably about late 70s. But he said,
okay.
what got you here won't get you there, is one of his books. That the thing that gets you to this point in your career, it's not going to get you there. But he loves his Kentucky background. Thinking
I think
about,
you brought up a point though that's interesting. One thing that I've noticed, I've hired hundreds of former fighter pilots and Navy SEALs, veterans, and I know you're a veteran. And one thing that I've noticed, that there is a personality trait that's indigenous in most of us, and that is, we definitely love the adrenaline spike. I mean, that's what we live for, right? And I would say that if you had to, codify who I was in one word, it would be, I'm in the pursuit of things. I'm happiest when I'm pursuing.
Mm.
But I think for a lot of folks that had my background, that adrenaline spike is really important, and it started to drive their lives when they were professionals. So if you think about, a fighter pilot's mission, you're fat, dumb, and happy, so to speak, in the squadron. And then all of a sudden you see your name up on the flying board, meaning that you're going to fly tomorrow. And oh, by the way, you're the flight leader, and there's 3 other peers in your flight, and one of them's a weapons school graduate. So all of a sudden now, your adrenaline starts to creep up, because you're like, wow, by tomorrow morning, I've got to put together a world-class briefing. I have to be completely ready, and I have to look great in front of my peers while I'm executing a mission. So already you start to get geared in towards that mission. And then, you get a sleepless night, you wake up very early in the morning, you drive to the squadron early, you get your briefing boards just perfect, and then you make more tweaks. And then finally, everybody comes in, the adrenaline starts to increase more and more. And now you're giving your briefing, you're going to choreograph exactly the way this thing's going to unfold in the perfect world. And we all know that's never going to happen, but that's what we do in the briefing. And then the briefing's over, and then you walk into PE room and get your flying gear on. And as you're putting your G suit on and putting your helmet in the helmet bag, throw it over your shoulder. Now you're walking out to the flight line. There's the mighty Eagles. You're on the flight line, getting close to the jet. Salute to the crew chief, up the ladder, strap in, canopy comes down, adrenaline spike gets higher and higher and higher. Then you go fly the mission, you come back and land, and everything's just down to the dirt for a minute. And then you walk in, and then you have to debrief. So now the adrenaline gets back up again, because now you have to recreate everything that happened. And you're going to be graded in your peers' eyes on how well you remembered all the intricate details while you're pulling 9Gs on your back, and recreate the debrief. And then finally, when the debrief is over, you have a beer in the squadron room and you can go home. And that adrenaline rush is over. And it is such a powerful tool. And then you go get a good night's sleep, and it starts all over again. And it's the same for, Navy SEAL or warrior that's downrange, and except this time it's not scheduled. I'm in the middle of the night, there's an explosion on base and everybody's scrambling, but you're kind of always on. The next day you might be kicking indoors in an urban environment. So one of the things that I've noticed is when these great veterans then come back into the workplace, the conversation I have with them is, what are you going to do now? I mean, I know that your body craves this adrenaline spike, and you're not going to be able to recreate that anywhere else for the rest of your life. So I know one thing for sure, you're going to either recreate it in one or 2 ways, a bright spot or a dark side. And you're a really smart person. So most people are never going to know if you're manifesting this on the dark side. So I would really highly encourage you to get all in on a hobby, all in on a career as early as possible, and put everything into it, because you are going to struggle for a while when you get out. And I've just seen this play over and over and over again. I don't know if you experienced it.
Yeah, it's so very interesting. And not only that, but friends of mine who were in special forces saw some horrendous things and then had PTSD, not immediately. It was sometimes 7 years later. Where in some ways the armed forces try and wipe their hands of it, go, well, it's long ago, it's not our problem anymore. But it should be. You should always be there for them, because they gave their lives, and in many cases they had friends who lost their lives. And there has to be this deal, and this is where one of the previous guests on here, General the Lord Dannett, who was my commanding officer, had this covenant, the Army covenant. Look, we'll serve the armed forces, we'll serve for you, and we'll give our lives, but please look after us when we're injured, mentally, physically, or something happens to us. Please look after the families too. And it wasn't that kind of way in the British Army, but it got better. But again, we've now been diminished. I mean, I was in an army of 180,000, which is nothing compared to the American army, but it's now 70,000. And so it's so tiny, but yet we're at a time of the greatest threats with Russia and Ukraine, and the Middle East is afire. and you've got what's China going to do with Taiwan. I think in some ways it's a more dangerous time than any time in my 62 years. What do you think, Jim?
Oh, without a doubt. And you brought up PTSD. I'm just talking about even just the normal, rigors of getting out of an operational tempo, like a lot of our men and women come out of in all of our militaries. But without a doubt, right now is I think the most dangerous time we've seen. We've got a lot of global uncertainty. We've got a lot of this is a leadership podcast. I mean, to be quite honest with you, we are in desperate need of leaders around the world. And because there's such a vacuum of leadership, you see a lot of strife and uncertainty and unrest because of it. Start right here in the United States if you want to, but you can poke holes everywhere. It's just amazing to me. It seems like in a very short amount of time, to me, it seems like, in the last 10 or 15 years, we've just seen this absolute ram dump of great leadership and decision making that just doesn't seem to be there right now. I remember I did a post on LinkedIn a few years ago during COVID, and at the time, Russia was starting to rattle its sabers again, and obviously the U.S. has this issue with China. But I was kind of thinking about our own government and everything, and I realized, holy crap, somebody my age, I was raised that the government was going to be there. They're protecting our American dream. There was compliance, there was governance, there was things in place to ensure that we could create and strive and scale our American dream. But about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I realized nobody's really protecting our American dream anymore. We're on our own. Certainly not the government. It's certainly not the media. And, it became really clear to me that that probably was never the case. Because now we just have a lot more transparency on what's going on. So I think it's interesting because I think right now it's a dangerous place because the barriers and the walls are kind of porous.
No, I mean, we could go into great depth on all the topics and what's going to happen to Ukraine and what's going on with Israel and Gaza and how's it going to spread with Red Sea and Houthis and all sorts of stuff.
That's
but
right.
let's just, not that it's not important, it's hugely important, but just almost park that one and bring it back to you. And because I think that the personal stories are always very telling for people who are listening. They want to, tips and advice that they have. Let's just run through a few things from you, Murph, which is like back to that farm boy when you were like 16 or you're doing your basketball. By the way, I just come back from cycling through 7 Emirates in 7 days. And we had a lovely collection of 20 different people. There was an Italian colonel who'd been a helicopter pilot. Poor guy had been exposed to depleted uranium when he was in Bosnia and picking up lots of civilians and things from burning tanks and stuff. And he's got 24 different illnesses from all the heavy metals and stuff in his body. But yet he cycles a tricycle. He's got a little oxygen tube behind him and an oxygen tank, but he's at 50 kilometers an hour on his bike. And I can't even get that kind of speed. I thought sort of 35, 40 was pretty good, but he's there powering away. Anyway, so we did these 7 Emirates. But the reason I mention it is just this lovely collection of different people and the experiences they'd all had, and they all brought together at one time in one place. A number of them were forces. I've certainly lost my train of thought, but I think it was like we were there with children in orphanages and disabled children and things to try and really add stuff back. But going back to when you were growing up, what sort of wisdom would you give the young Murph if you met yourself age 16 to 18? What matters, what doesn't, to the young people who are listening today?
Great question. Well, let's start with maybe my thoughts on what you might do with your career. I think maybe the biggest mistake I made was not going big earlier. And some people might argue that I did because, I didn't stay in as a career Air Force officer. I jumped to become an entrepreneur and scale a business. And there's a lot of things that I did. I may not even mention this, but I was an airline pilot for a short stint with United Airlines. So certainly I've tried different things, but I think, had I started Afterburner when I originally got the idea, I would have been 6 or 7 years ahead of when I actually launched it. And that would have made a huge difference. Another thing that I think that my biggest advice would be is don't be afraid to go large, because you only are trending in life in a lot of ways for a short amount of time. And don't take that for granted, thinking that it might last forever, because it might be a cycle that you're in. It might be, you might have caught the wind just perfectly. You might be in a lifelong scalable business, but you might not. And when you find yourself, trending in the green, so to speak, don't be afraid to try to stand it on its tail and really go large at that point. Leverage relationships, maybe go ahead and take that investment income. Maybe, create, if you're in a service business, more of a recurring revenue subscription-based, launch that software, pivot that business into that direction. Seize the moment, because a lot of times those moments are fleeting at best.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you don't really control the environmental factors that gave you that opportunity. And I think that's something I've learned over time.
Yeah, great wisdom. And I think so often we're a little bit timid about it, or we just get complacent and think, like there's that short book, Who Moved My Cheese? And do you remember that one?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and you keep
Ken
thinking,
Blanchard? I think it was
yeah, that's
Ken
right, Ken
Blanchard.
Blanchard. I think it is Ken Blanchard. And
He's a
you keep
great
coming
guy.
back thinking, yeah, it'll always be there. It'll be like that every day. And then suddenly it's not. Or people who've been, as you and I have, and many of those we know, been in the armed forces, and they have this identity, which is, I am a fighter pilot. And then they leave and they're not a fighter pilot anymore. Well, who are they? And like, who am I? And this crisis of confidence of who they are. Let's go around the Inspiring Leadership Compass with a few tips from you based on your own experience. Moral quotient. We talk about your Christian values, and also the importance of being, this consistency of who you are at home and who you are at work. Some people think, oh, I'm two different people. Well, that creates a problem in itself. But what did you learn when you let your own strong values, because you have strong values, what did you learn when you let them slip, and how do you get yourself back on track? If people are listening and they've got off true north, how do they get back on again?
Well, I've certainly done that more than once, and it took me a while because I'm a slow learner. But one of the things that I actually teach and we talk about in our speaking engagements is, it's not just the ability for you to grind and hustle that makes you successful with your enterprise. It's really about alignment. And it's not necessarily about aligning everybody. It's about you being aligned with the business and who you say you are and what you're actually doing. So, some examples in business are, the founder of Uber, started to live a lifestyle outside of the general principles and the guiding precepts that he started at Uber. And quickly, Uber said, we can't have this anymore. So the founder's out, looking from the outside in. And, that was self-deprecating on Travis's part. And then, you might have somebody like Papa John's Pizza, and, you can see the founder there, John Schnatter, same thing, happened. And, he finds himself in a really short amount of time, brilliant founder, brilliant business, looking on the outside in. So, and I look at my own career, and it's happened to me multiple times as well. I mean, sometimes you start getting the success, you start, maybe believing that more of the success has to do with you personally and the strings that you're pulling. But more importantly, if you start living outside of the guiding precepts and the principles that you hold dear in your business, but you're not holding that dear personally, the first people that notice, besides your family, is certainly the business and all the folks that you're trying to inspire and align.
Yeah.
And immediately you lose credibility, momentum. And that's where I see businesses spin out of control very, very quickly. And it can happen within a larger enterprise too, if you're an executive within your own team. So, we could probably come up with tons of examples like this.
No, but I think that's why I always start with moral quotient, true north, as being the where you begin from. If you have no principles, no foundations, even the old cad Oscar Wilde said that when you have no values and principles, anything, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for everything. You've got or a gentleman or a lady is someone who knows what they will do and what they won't do. And when you start to do the things you said you were not going to do, there are problems. I was just remembering with my story about the UAE when I drifted off, that one of the lovely guys who'd come from America and was Herb Lang. You won't have known him, but Herb was a Harlem Globetrotter. And when we went into some of the schools, he was doing his old tricks with the old basketball around his shoulders and throwing it up and it landing on his back. And the kids just loved Herb. And he had been 18 years as a Harlem Globetrotter. But when it ended, and it ended just very suddenly for him, which he wasn't expecting, just like his whole identity, he'd been a Harlem Globetrotter. What did he do now? But he's now doing some wonderful work around kindness is key with school children and things like that, and really giving back, having had a tough upbringing and the way it is. From moral quotient to PQ, meaning and purpose. What this is really key to about this purpose, mission, vision, values, that kind of stuff. It's all part of your own work. But if you were to give a quick tip to people about finding their mission and purpose in life, because you clearly living your life on purpose, but there's been times when you probably maybe have been off purpose and you brought yourself back on. What's your tip about finding what your purpose is and living it?
Well, for me right now, it's, I'm a father, and I have two young sons. So for me, it, once I had children, it completely elevated the game well beyond ever being a CEO. Because now I feel like, if you want to be an imposter, if anybody's going to find it quicker than anybody, it's going to be your own family. And if you're going to regret something, you might get past it with your peer group or even with your professional colleagues, but with family, it could be permanent. So you've really got to have your act together. And you talk about the zero error for tolerance world of military aviation. I think it's more being a father of two young boys right now. So for me, that purpose is really driven here in the home. But I think that I would say that, for me, when I really look at what I enjoy doing and what drives purpose for me is I love to instruct. I mean, at my core, that's what I like to do. I like to help other people utilize a skill, a talent, or a lesson learned that I've had the unique privilege to receive from other things, and help them accelerate their own personal experience. And at the core of everything that I've ever done, it's really that instructor mentality. And for me, that's what gives me a lot of purpose, whether it's working with my own sons on, fishing, or, their baseball or homework, or, a young entrepreneur or veteran that's transitioning into the world. For me, that gives me a lot of purpose.
That's really helpful. And taking that even further, so for others maybe coming out of the armed services, or even just that they're bumbling along in business, how do you help them when they don't know what their life purpose is? How do you help them really nail it down and live it?
Well, I mean, this will, for me, it's all about, look, Jonathan, you can't predict the future. You can't, right? But you can design the one you want. I mean, isn't that liberating?
Yeah.
You can design the one that you want. Have you ever done that? And most people say, well, no. And I go, well, then you're living by the whims of the day, of the economy, of the environment. You're not purposeful in anything that you're doing because you've never seen your future. And, you can't predict it, but you can design the one you want and see that. And now you can start aligning your peer groups, your decisions, your finances. Everything starts to fall in place. And when most people talk about vision boards and talk about their future, it's in generalities. What I try to force people to do is create absolute specifics, lots of context. The more context, almost like a movie, the more emotion, the more real it becomes. It takes me back to those days when I was a farm boy and I met a fighter pilot, and certainly this person inspired me. And I had other people say, well, you ought to consider the military, but I'm not going to leave the comfort of my current life to go do something as radical as join the military unless something's really compelling me to do it, right? But when I saw the movie and there was music and there was a motorcycle and Kelly McGillis and F-14s and excitement at my stage in my life, I could see myself in that movie. And it was so compelling that I figured out what I needed to do to go live that life. And I try to get people to kind of create that for their own personal journeys. And we do that obviously with companies as well.
Yeah, no, and clearly very successfully. Health, you mentioned a healthcare business that you were involved in, but I'm interested in health and longevity, wellness. Certainly now that I'm in my 60s, I want to keep fit and healthy, and like doing this cycling competition, 7 Emirates, 7 days with my colleagues. And I might even go and do another battlefield bike ride tour from the D-Day beaches all the way to Paris, maybe in June. But I've been training in the gym this morning. I've converted the garage into a proper, fully equipped gym, and 3-4 times a week, I will do some pretty serious strength-based exercise. What do you do? And because you're clearly in good shape, but what do you do to keep mentally and physically in good shape, and you'd advise others to do the same?
Obviously, as an athlete and then as a fighter pilot, anaerobic exercise was big as fighter pilots pulling G's. And so, I've lifted weights my whole life and gone to the gym. It's always just been a critical part of my life. I mean, my entire life I've been working out. But until recently, I didn't realize truly how important everything you put in your body really is. And until you get your diet right, the cycling, the weightlifting, that stuff's additive, but it really doesn't drive your health future. And what I used to just take for granted is even the smallest thing that you put in your mouth and you consume truly has a big impact on your body. And whether it's alcohol, whether it's certain types of fats, truly until I mapped out what I was eating, and then I understood what maybe, I've got high cholesterol here, or I've got something going on over here with my liver, until I really understood how certain foods were affecting the outcome of the results from labs, did I really realize that every single calorie that you intake has to have a purpose. If not, it's going to go somewhere that you don't want it to go.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, even the smallest things matter. So I've started fasting about 6 months ago, and it's not a heavy fast. I just don't eat after 7, and I don't eat my first meal until 11:30 in the morning. And that in itself's made a huge difference because now I have less calories to keep track of, only really 2 meals. And then that's made a big difference for me.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. I'm very fortunate. I've got a great guy, Adam Northcote, and Adam is a bodybuilder, and so he's my personal trainer. He's created an app, and his wife trains my wife. And as you say, there's everything. He's very specific with me to build muscle. I don't want to become a bodybuilder, but I want to be more muscular as I get older, because you got to get out of chairs and things like that. It's
Right.
longevity is
Yep.
linked to it. But as you say, everything I put in my body, I'm looking at the makeup of the macronutrients and what I have before I train, after I train. And it's really interesting. And it's very helpful knowing that I'm just going to follow this. I'm not going to have anything else. And it really helps to get leaner and get fitter. So yeah, I'm right with you all the way. We're almost coming to the end, tragically, because there's so much that we can cover. Let me just think of a couple of things. I think the first one I'd pick of all the 8 components would be emotional and social intelligence. Your ability to get on well with clients, to build new business, make a connection with people. Too many people I know, they go, I'm really good at delivering, but I can't seem to sell, because they don't make a relationship with someone. People don't buy them, as well as having your good IP, clearly. So how do you listen well to others, Murph? What's your tip to people?
Well, I think I've failed in this department for a good portion of my life. I was more of a communicator than a listener. And as I got older, I realized that the 51% rule really should, for me, because I feel like I'm a fairly ADHD type person, needs to be the 80-20 rule, meaning, I had to be listening 80% of the time and speaking 20% of the time. And I might get to about 51% listening versus speaking. So I've worked really hard on that the last 10 years or so. The other thing I think that you have to force yourself to actively listen is to be truly interested in listening to what the person is saying from a stories perspective, because what I like to do is deeply listen and then read back what I heard. So I'm affirming with my listener that I'm paying attention and I'm digesting what they're saying. So when I started kind of mechanizing that and doing that with most conversations that I have, I think my EQ went up, my relationships and were deeper. And, obviously I think that helps in business. So, you know, I just think whatever technique that you can come up with to try to cut back on how much you're communicating in a two-way conversation and make it much more about their conversation, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, very wise words. There was a lovely guy, Oscar Trimbolia, had from Australia on the podcast, and he deep listening is his big thing. He said there's 5 levels. You listen to yourself, there's stuff going on in your own head. You listen for the content, the context. You listen to the unsaid, and you also listen for meaning. But like you, I find when I'm coaching a CEO or with an individual, I will often just look through some just very simple notes that I've made. Not too much. I mind map because I'm dyslexic. But I go, can I just play back what I've heard you say and where I'm curious, what I was wondering I didn't hear? So is this, am I right? Yeah, yeah. Oh, right. It's quite interesting. I haven't heard, having it played back to me. Oh, what do you think now? What are your thoughts on my thoughts on your thoughts? And then they have some more thoughts. So like you, I found that very useful. Let's go towards the end. The last couple of questions I had really, which was, executive teams. You're constantly developing and speaking about executive teams. You built them. You've seen good ones. You've seen bad ones. What do you do when you've got a toxic team, or there's an individual in that team that's toxic? What would be your top tip to people who are out there listening to that now? They're going, "Help me, Murph. I've got to really just the team's gone bad. They're all just eating at shit."
As a leader, this is your number one role. Besides, helping to create the future, the vision, and hold people accountable to getting there, it's toxic teams. And, inevitably you have to kill the toxic team. And inevitably that means somebody is going to have to go. And it's not something that you're not going to be able to necessarily coach through. If the team is now toxic to the point where you believe it's fundamentally changing the direction of the business, it's too late. So, for me anyways, it's, you go to the source of that and you do your best to find out exactly where the source is. And if you're not 110% sure of it, then you don't make any moves, you don't take action. But if then that person has got to go. And then you've got to bring that, or persons, and then you've got to bring the team back together and reestablish the future again. You got to realign. And that takes time. And, if this happened on your watch, then I think you really need to look in the mirror as well and understand how you allowed this to atrophy to the point where you've had to take this kind of action, because in a sense, it's a failure of your own leadership as well. So, I've seen this in my own lifetime more than I care. And I've handled it well and not well. And I think every time when I handled it not well is because I delayed, or maybe I had a special relationship with one of the toxic team members and I wanted to give him or her another chance, maybe even a second chance. And in my case, a third chance. What I've learned now is you and the team does not have any time for that. You've got to cut it right now, realign and move on.
Yeah. Very, very wise advice. Favorite book? What would be a good leadership book you'd recommend to people?
Oh, leadership book. Well, I'll tell you, it's not a leadership book, but I read it as part of my own leadership once a year. It's a business book called The E-Myth. And now it's The E-Myth revisited, but revised, but it's by an author, Michael Gerber. It's a pretty old book. It's been around a long time. I read it when I first became an entrepreneur, and it struck me. And the book basically says that we're all technicians. We start out as proficient or experts in whatever we decide to do. And then we think we're so good at it that we can go put her up our own shingle and scale our own business around that technique or that technician part of us. And the book's just wonderfully written and talks about the pitfalls of actually scaling. And it talks about some basic protocols that any business needs to have, standard operating procedures, checklists, and all the things that we've been talking about from a leadership perspective. I like to read that book once a year. It reframes the basic fundamentals of being a leader of an enterprise or even a small business, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. The E-Myth Revisited. So we're at the end now, Murph. Would you just kindly, in a moment, introduce yourself, say the kind of work you're doing now, what you did in the past, and in that 2 minutes, give us a tip, a top leadership tip that people could take away and go, that's useful. I'm going to practice that. So over to you.
Sure. Well, my name is James D. Murphy. I'm a former Air Force F15 fighter pilot turned entrepreneur. I went from farm boy to fighter pilot. And for the last 25 years, I've been teaching the ethos of being a fighter pilot into a scalable heuristic or framework to help individuals, teams, and organizations scale and win. I've worked with people like an NFL team like the New York Giants turn their season around to win the Super Bowl, or large companies and enterprises like Target and Home Depot. But more importantly, at my heart, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've started a healthcare business and sold it. And now I have my own private equity firm where we're buying and organically starting companies to scale them based on the tools and the techniques that I've learned in my lifetime as a business person. I think maybe the biggest takeaway and the biggest thing that I can maybe offer is, as a leader, it's so important for you to realize you can't predict the future, but you can design the one that you want personally, and also the team that you care about, whether that's your family, your organization, or your company. And it truly is not about the generalities of the future. It's about going into a set time in the future, maybe 2 years on this day, and opening up your eyes and in as much detail as possible, describing what you see from a financial perspective, a branding perspective, a human capital perspective, what you will do and won't do. And what you'll find out is the more details, the more realistic, the more compelling, the more purpose-driven you will be. And, oh, by the way, if you are stuck and wondering how to get started, once you understand the future in great detail, it'll be very obvious what step 1, 2, and 3 are and what are the most urgent steps to take right now.
Fantastic. Well, look, it's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast. You clearly have a wealth of experience that you help instruct and train other people with, and you're living being an inspiring leader. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, sir. I really enjoyed it, and want to wish all your listeners happy hunting out there, and I hope they have a great 2024.
Thanks so much indeed, Jim. Bye.